today we have with us Monique Trương, an extraordinary writer. She is so accomplished that if I have to tell you all of her accomplishments, it would take me an hour to do that. So I would highly recommend that you go to her website and check her out. What I can tell you right now is that Monique Trương is the author of 3 novels. The first one is, can you see it? Oh,
yeah, you can hold a bit more.
The Book of Salt. The second one, Bitter in the Mouth. And the third one, The Sweetest Fruits. All 3 of the novels won multiple prizes, and all 3 of them are translated in multiple foreign languages. The Book of Salt has been translated into more than a dozen foreign languages. So if you have not read her books, in the Vietnamese way of saying, you mất nửa cuộc đời. So you have wasted half of your life. The way the Vietnamese people often say is actually mất cả cuộc đời, mất cả cuộc đời. So you have wasted your whole life. So you have to go out there and look for a book and read them. So all these 3 books, in all these 3 novels, you write about food. Yummy, delicious, sensual, but you also write about food in a way that goes beyond the savory sensory. When did you start having a special relationship with food?
Well, first, Anvi and PQ, it's a pleasure to be with you today and to have this conversation. I'm really appreciative and touched that you want to know more about my work. My relationship with food, I think, changed when I first came to the United States. Actually, I was 6 years old, almost 7. When my mom and I were refugees in a relocation camp. And it was the first time that, I had to think about food, right? I was very, I had a very, frankly, a very privileged upbringing, up to that point where, food was just there. That is a privilege, right? Not to have to think about it on a daily basis. And there we were in the middle of a large amount of people where food was no longer being sort of provided by someone I knew, someone who loved me, someone who, cared what I ate. This was simply a mass sort of feeding, And I know that when you asked that question, you were probably thinking, oh, there must have been, some moment of, I don't know, a heightened pleasure or something positive, as opposed to what I'm telling you now. But I think it's important to acknowledge that food is both about, it can be about pleasure and being satiated and being fed and loved, and it can be exactly the opposite as well. And when you start to understand the opposite, that other side of the coin is when you don't take it for granted anymore, and you start to really kind of look at it from really the outside. It's just in the same way that I think about language. Food and language for me are actually like this, because it happened at the same time in my life where language was no longer something natural to me, something that belonged to me. It was something I had to acquire, just like food all of a sudden, something that was different from everything that I had ever known before. Yeah.
I really appreciate that. Yeah, knowing the other side of the coin. It's true. People think of food as delicious, sensual, sensual. And when you talk about food and language, as one for you, I understood why the second book, Bitter in the Mouth, you talk about your main character is the one who has a neural condition when she can taste food when she hears or uses certain words. So that's very interesting. Fascinating. Yeah. That's the book that I read in just a few sittings.
Okay. So I'm curious to know, when you started that book, what did you think about the narrator? What was your idea of who that narrator was?
You asking me? Well, I was familiar with the Vietnamese American community in the US already. I read that book when I was here, when I came here to study. It was a few years after I came and I found that book. It could be 5 or 6 years. So I was very aware of the Vietnamese Americans. And when I read that, I knew it has to be a Vietnamese American woman. So that was in the back of my mind. But what draws me to that is the narrative, the language. It's just it's captivating. It's captivating. It pulls you in. That's what the audience, right, the readers want. The story and the language that pull them in many ways. And for me, a lot of it is a social underlining, because I care about social equality, social justice, and that is the underlining line for me.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great.
But it's just I have never heard about that condition before, so I was very curious, of course, very intrigued to keep going, to see what happened, not just what happened to her, but how you portray a character, a Vietnamese American. I want to know how you would portray a Vietnamese American.
I like to have a little bit of footnote in that. I find it is fascinating, and in the way that almost more than necessary, that one can project the gender of the character and or sometimes of the author as well. I think in the own past, with the sexism, and sometimes people say, "Oh, it sounds like it's written by the man or by women," or blah blah blah. But I think with the current time, I think we should be proud and should be able to let people know that the character has, or even through that with the author too, can reflect a sense of some sort of gender or an identity in there. And for me, in the field of music, I also find that very, very, very important. And so congratulations. I don't know if that is what you think I think it's a good thing or not, but I'm very, very fascinated with that. There another thing that you just said that I sort of envy of your situation, that you say that language is very natural to you. And I grew up with a little bit different situation, that I for a long time, more than 40 years, that have never trusted languages. And I grew up, learned French first in school, and even before the second grade, then I use mainly French, even at home or in school, of course, or sometimes even with my nanny. Then when the language changed into Vietnamese, then voila, I have to learn the new type language. Then after that, when the communists come over, then I have to took 4 years of Russian. Then we came to US, we had to learn English. Then after a few years, I went to Italy for a year. Then I have to learn Italian and come back here and learn English again. So for many years, languages seem to betray me more than a kind of a faithful communication form to me. Not into somewhat recently that I I can come back and trust language fully. Even though go to a long period of time, I live in a language. Let's say if I speak Vietnamese, I behave like a Vietnamese. If I speak English, I behave like a typical American. Or if I speak French, and I start to behave like that. But the sense of being betrayed by languages could be difficult and painful sometimes. So I envy you for that kind of natural gratification and feeling and good relationship with the languages.
You have a question?
Yeah. So
It's a question.
so based on that, I start to go a little bit question on your not really recent, maybe almost 10 years by now, of your working relationship with composer. And I understand that you how did you start with that?
Well, it was never a goal of mine because I didn't think of it as I don't know. I suppose I was never really trained in music, and it wasn't part of my sort of writing community to begin with. Ever since I was young, I wanted to be a writer, but I never thought about, being a lyricist or a librettist. It just wasn't, a goal that I could see, right? It wasn't something I was working towards. But then I met a composer while I was in Italy at an artist residency. And once we got back to the US, her name is Joan LaBarbera, and she asked me to, work on a song for her.
Why not?
Yeah, and I have to admit, I asked, well, why me? Because she's a really well-known composer, and she really could work with anyone. And she had read my first novel, The Book of Salt, and she just the language spoke to her, and I thought, well, why not? And I think the thing that surprised me the most about working with composers is that I enjoy the process of collaboration. As a novelist, it's you. You are the king, you are the queen of your domain. And while that comes with it all the power and the control, it's also incredibly lonely, right? At a after 3 novels, it just didn't it felt too lonely. As I wanted a creative process that was more of a give and take. And so I think that's really what keeps me working with
Ah.
composers. After Joan, I started working with other folks, and they came to me more than the other way around, because like I said, it's, I'm not, trained in a classical sense in any way. So I'm learning. I'm learning on the job, as it were. And that is also incredibly exciting.
But right there, Monique, I find it's very, very fascinating and generous of you, because immediately as the position of, like you say, I'm an emperor, I'm a king, I'm a queen in my own field, then almost like step, I wouldn't say down or up, but step toward another side, that willing to be a collaborator, willing to share your podium. But anyway, from there, may I have a little bit more technical question? Because you just narrated, you say that at first, or you talk about the separation between a lyricist and become a librettist. Could you tell us a little bit more about that? Maybe you can help our audience to understand a little bit more about the differences between those two.
Well, I'm sure, PQ, that you would be the better person to answer that. But I can tell you that, for me, I understand the difference as, a librettist is someone who is writing, well, I mean, it is, I think, definitionally, it's about writing the lyrics for an opera, right? Or a song cycle, something with a narrative through line. And a lyricist tends to be a standalone, song or a choral work. All these things I've written and worked on. And, the project that I am still working on with Joan LaBarbera is an opera, and it's based on the life of a sculptor named Joseph Cornell and the writer Virginia Woolf. And it's and your audience, and maybe you too, will immediately kind of come to the realization that those two people have nothing to do with each other. They never met in life. They are simpatico in the mind of the composer, and now in the mind of my mind as the librettist. So it's to tease out this narrative, right? Which is what a novelist does, So in that sense, I can say that, I feel well equipped to be a librettist. But I think one of the things that I've realized that I think also made me sort of inclined towards being a librettist and a lyricist is that when I write, I always read my words aloud. There is a certain rhythm to the way that I want, and I want my work to be read, but also a certain rhythm in the way that I write my words, And so, and when I say rhythm in a prose sense, I mean, for example, the length of a sentence. It could be a series of long, sort of compound sort of thoughts, and then when you hear it read aloud that you need something short, to the point, almost sharp. You can see that I'm already, I mean, I have thought about my prose writing in I think in musical terms for a long time. I just didn't really understand that that's what I was doing. And so I suppose I'm sharing this with you because I kind of felt like I feel that maybe Joan really did, see something in my novels that I wasn't seeing, that she saw that I had the capacity and the sort of the inclination to work in as a lyricist and a librettist long before I knew it. But yeah, I'm not quite sure if I really have responded to your question, Vicky, about the difference between
It's
the
very,
two.
very, very fascinating. And the next thing is, as I mentioned about being artists and being very egoistic, with being very central in a way. So could you share with us about at what collaborative level are you willing to be with your composer? I have run into librettists before, just to not like I work with them, but I just understand and talk to them before that very often that they may not be willing to change even one word. So I wonder how generous or how willingly are you at your collaborative level?
I want to add my question to that as well because it's related. I watched the performance of the Murmuration of Chibok. It's fascinating. It's a very exciting event on stage. Besides the text, there is vocalization, a lot of vocalization and acting as well. So I'm curious what your collaborative process like for specifically in that piece.
Okay, these are great questions. Well, I work differently with each of the composers because they work differently. And I always have that conversation with them at the beginning of our process, I, like I, said earlier, these composers often come to me with a project that they have in mind. So, and sometimes it's very fully formed already. And I really do think I often will and set, my ego aside because I do feel that I'm there as a way to help them realize a project. Maybe not all librettists will think this way, but I think of it in the same way as, if an opera is a fully realized work with scenery and staging and all of that, I'm one of the components. I'm not the, to me, that when I go to an opera, honestly, I'm there for the whole work and I'm there for the music. I read very early on, so I can't even remember where, but someone probably was being kind of ironic and snide about the idea that if you go to an opera and what you really hear and focus on is the libretto, then there's something probably wrong with the libretto. Right? I mean, it should be the complete work, right? Anyways, so
yeah,
There is
so
a
to
joke
follow
actually.
a footnotes and that hardcore opera goers are pay attention on the libretto a lot. Yeah, very, very, very much. And let's say these are old stuff, but if we read the libretto of Carmen or the libretto of Wozzeck, word by word, and I must say that it's just incredibly intelligent and it beyond any composer that could have thought of.
But
And I
also,
think
because you talk about the hardcore opera goer, it is one way of thinking. There is a kind of urban tale about the relationship between the composer and the librettist, which is if you go to an opera and you enjoy everything, that means the libretto works. Everybody forgets about the librettist. So,
Yeah.
but if you go to an opera and you pay attention to the libretto, that means there is something wrong with the libretto, and so you will blame the failure of the opera to the librettist. So it's like a double whammy for writers or librettists in a way. That's a funny
Well,
thing.
I think that there's also a difference between the the kind of bel canto tradition of of operas and the the operas that are incredibly well known and often performed. And you're right, it's kind of uh, people do know those pieces and they know sort of the storyline, and they know, I mean, it's part of the pleasure is to know these words and to as well as the music. But I'm working with contemporary, clearly composers. These are brand new works, so maybe one day, someone will sit down and actually read my words in the same way that, for example, I'll read, I'm trying to think of a librettist that I very much admire. Like the opera Peter Grimes, is an opera that I read the libretto and I am in love with it, But anyways, I want to sort of to also answer Anvi's question about Murmuration of Chibok. And that piece was by Joan LaBarbera. It's a choral work that was commissioned by the Young People's Chorus of New York City, and they are that chorus is incredible in terms of its talent, but also in the way that they present each of their pieces. They have choreographers that they work with. They have, they just really bring it to life. And so in terms of what my collaborative process was with them, I went with Joan to speak with the singers as to explain to them the piece, because the piece was really a very hard one to not only to write, but also to sort of impart upon these young singers. These are, young, as you saw there. We worked mainly with high school age girls, and that was only a component of the chorus. But Joan really wanted to focus the work and share it with those singers. And the reason why is the piece is about, she wanted a piece about the Nigerian schoolgirls that had been kidnapped. And that began in 2014. And it was devastating to her. It's a devastating story that there are girls going to school and being taken away for the simple act of wanting to learn, right? And she wanted girls to sing this, and we needed to impart upon them the kind of that this experience is not about them singing about others. Girls in New York City singing about girls far away in Nigeria. So that to me was a really important process of the collaboration, was to be able just to speak with them and to say, when I wrote these words, I thought about you. as well as the schoolgirls. And I thought about, you know, all of you inhabiting the bodies, female bodies, young female bodies. And that's what, you know, that's what the shared experience is, right? And the rest of it, what you saw on stage was courtesy of you know, the chorus, the and the conductor and all of that. That part was incredibly powerful to me when I finally saw it. You know, there's a certain point where, you know, as the librettist, you're gone. You know, you hand it over. You hand it over to the musicians, the singers, and it is absolutely amazing to sit in the audience and see it come to life, because it's your words, but it's taken on a completely it's taken on dimensions that you can only hope for, right?
Talking about young people, I was thinking about how you said when you wrote the text for the songs, you read out loud. It's a very interesting thing to do, but something I'm also familiar with in a way, because I was told that when you write as a writer, you hear the voice in your head. What you learn writing for the songs, can you impart the lesson back to the writers in a way that, you know, okay, this is something that could be beneficial to writers and you could try out. And another part I want to ask is because when you talk about this is about language and writing, and I know that these days a lot of Vietnamese people, they learn English well. They go to the US to study at a young age, and then they can be fluent in English. And then they will begin to write in English more and more. And English is their second language. What is your advice for them in terms of writing, using the experience you learn from writing for music? Does it make sense? It's a lot of things going on in my mind about. I'm thinking of the rhythm and the voice in your head when you write, and you speak out loud when you write for songs, and how do you incorporate all that lesson, all that experience, and give young people something they can take away?
Okay, well, let's see. You know, I think what I would say is that the first voice that you have to hear, whether you're writing prose or you're writing a libretto, is your own voice. Because you have to trust that voice, you know? And that voice is always there. Even when you inhabit another character, that voice, your own voice, is always there. And you have to trust that person, right? I write my novels in the first person voice. I find that the most immediate way, the most visceral way of telling a story. So yes, you know, even though I've just said my voice is always there, I do inhabit someone else's voice when I'm writing. And part of that, to me, is how I develop the character, you know, how I understand my character, rather, right? I think about, do they use, you know, what is their vocabulary? Do they use, you know, very simple words, or do they, prefer what I call the SAT words, like what do they, what's their sense of humor? Like, are they ironic? Are they, do they have a dry sense of humor? That sort of thing. So this is all part of me understanding my character. But I think where that comes from, or where I sort of learn to do this, is from the fact that I listen in my day-to-day life. When I first came to the US, I even though PQ, you said that, you envy my sort of relationship with language, I understand very much what you said about feeling betrayed by language. The first 6 years of my life, language was not something I had to think about, right? But then in what felt like a blow to the body, a blow to the psyche, I didn't have language, and I had to acquire it again. And I was lucky, as you know, when you're a child, it's much easier to acquire a foreign language. But still, that I don't think I've ever forgotten that kind of ripping away of something that was so familiar and something so integral to me, right? So I tell you this because I feel like as a child in the US, for many years, even though I was acquiring language and I, became fluent, I was so scared to use it that I was pretty much a mute when I was a child, from 7 to the age of maybe, I'd say 7 to 9, 10, I was so shy. I was so awkward. I was so profoundly alone in my sense of community, everything, that I didn't really speak, and what that did was that if all I was doing was listening, and when you listen, you really do, you understand, you observe, you start to see how people express themselves, not only in words, really, and as you get older, you see that people express themselves using their hands, right? By their body. All these things become language, right? And I think that really is one of the this observation, this listening, is one of the best ways for a writer to prepare to write. So even, and I, in terms of being envious, PQ, I'm envious of you for having access to all these different languages. And Anvi, what you're talking about, a Vietnamese young person who acquires English as a second language and then is fluent enough to use it to create and to express themselves, that is a privilege, and that is a skill I wish I had. I have no other language fluency at this point in my life, except for the English language. I can understand Vietnamese, but on the level of a 6-year-old, it stopped when I came to the US. I'm in a kind of stagnation, right? So, and I had French at one point when I was a child, very basic, but still, it's these languages to me are no longer a set of skills, but they feel to me like ghosts, they haunt me. I feel like sometimes I reach for them in terms of the what I'm trying to achieve in terms of the cadence of my characters. Like my first, my first novel was written from the point of view of a Vietnamese man, and his thoughts are in Vietnamese, but I'm rendering them in English. So I'm trying to do something that is an impossibility for me. It's really an impossibility, except in this medium that is, fiction on a page. I'm asking you to believe that what you're reading are the thoughts of a Vietnamese man, even though you're reading them in English. And then who knows what it has become when it's been translated into Slovenian or into German, or into Italian, all the languages that it's made its way through, but that is part of the fiction, right? That's part of the magic of working in the as a novelist. Is if you, again, it's like what we were talking about with the libretto, right? If you are writing the novel if you're able to achieve what you're hoping to achieve, the reader should not have that experience. They should not be aware that they are reading a Vietnamese man's thoughts, right, in English. They should just be like, I'm sort of, I'm in this world, I'm in this mind, and it feels organic to me. And the narrative, the voice, everything feels like it's welcomed me in, and I'm here, and it feels right.
Yeah, I'm still very fascinated by the language acquisition process. You have your books translated. I mean, your books have been translated into many foreign languages, and you have worked with the translators and the foreign publishers. So language, you have incredible experience with languages. And what you said about the languages, I'm thinking with what you know now, why the Vietnamese language part in you stopped developing. I know the dramatic experience you went through, that is a big impact, but why does it stop? I'm thinking, if you know what you know now, how could you have done differently? Or how can Vietnamese parents, Vietnamese American parents do differently to keep that language part in their children? Right. Why does it stop, and how? Of course, the English language takes over. It's so many forces coming to you at once. And the one language takes over, it is already a blessing that it takes over and you grow in that medium. But still, what happens to the other part? Because now we know that it is a plus, it is a blessing to have another perspective, another language. So how can we grow that? How can we make it happen?
Right. Well, I mean, I know you can appreciate the fact that when my parents and I came to the States, this was in 1975, and we were settled in an area of the United States in North Carolina, in a very small town where there were no other Vietnamese. There were no other Asians, and I had no siblings, I do have a younger sister who was born in the States, but there's an 11-year difference between us. So those first years in the US was my mother, my father, and myself. And there was a kind of trauma that I am only starting to truly understand as I become older. That I don't know what to say except that they were desperate to begin life again, some form of life. And you know, I've had this exact same question that you, well, not the exact, but a form of this question posed to me many, many years ago when my first book came out. And I did a reading in Orange County, you know, in California. And I was doing, you know, a very large kind of, it was a reading in front of a very large audience, mostly Vietnamese Americans. And a man raised his hand and said, "Why are you here and speaking to us in English? Why don't you know your own language?" And, you know, and I have to admit that when I heard that question, it felt less of an accusation against me and more one against my parents. And that really hurt me because it, you know, I think that there are families where, you know, if there are multi-generations, there are siblings, you know, that language skill is kind of, it is within the family. You know, it can be something that is nurtured and kept. In my situation, it wasn't. But so, you know, my folks did the best that they could. But, you know, with that said, I realized that Vietnamese Americans today, having children, raising their young kids, it's certainly not the same context. There are language schools, you know, there are ways to, you know, keep more than one language alive, right? And that's a privilege. That's a privilege I didn't have, and my family and I didn't have. And so, you know, maybe part of your question is also, well, you know, you're no longer a kid, you're a grown adult. Why don't you go and, you know, you can relearn Vietnamese, right? Yeah, it's true. I could. And I've tried to, you know, I still can read, but very slowly. And I can't write, that's for sure, in Vietnamese. It's, I don't know, I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that, you know, can you hear the bells? Yeah.
What is that? Yeah.
Yeah, I live very close to a church, and so
Oh,
every hour
beautiful.
you can hear the bells. It's, you know, I think it's one of the ways that I really come to understand why people hold on to certain languages, you know, because you're used to being able to express yourself, to be fully human in you know, a language that you're fluent in, and to switch, it's not only difficult, but it also changes, like PQ said earlier, kind of, you become a different person, you know, and it's uncomfortable sometimes. You may not like that person that you become, right? When I switch to Vietnamese, I become a child. I become helpless. I become, you know, unable to express anything except kind of bodily needs. I'm hungry. I need to use the bathroom, you know, I'm like all these things that make me feel diminish, you know? So So I think anyone out there who has tried and not succeeded, you know, or keeps on trying and yet feel like they can't quite get to that other sort of language. I mean, because it's hard, because it affects you not just intellectually, but emotionally, you
I
know?
really love that. I really love what you talked about languages and the privilege and what people keep and not keeping. I want to clarify my thinking when I posed that question. Of course, I didn't mean to hurt anybody. I care deeply about the Vietnamese language because that's my mother tongue. I'm fluent in Vietnamese. I told you that young Vietnamese these days acquire the English language. They are fluent in the English language. You said it's a privilege. Yes, it is a privilege. But I'm also have experienced that, you know, they are so passionate. They are so drawn to the English language because it is a privilege. It will move. It will get them to the higher status. It is it helps them to climb the social ladder. So English learning in Vietnam is fancy. It's a
social
trend.
status.
It's social status. It's a trend. Nowhere in the world do you see people learning English passionately as it is in Vietnam.
Like the same thing in the old day in Vietnam during colonial time. Learning French is a social status.
More. Yes, similar to that, but it could be more because they can reach a point when children in Vietnam, they can be fluent in English and not Vietnamese. They live in Vietnam. They are surrounded by Vietnamese people. Their parents are Vietnamese, and they refuse to be fluent in Vietnamese.
That happened in India as well. We can see part of
for me.
India.
I'm brokenhearted to see things like that. So I always think about how we can keep something of our own. That's all. That's what I want.
But perhaps that could be another subject that we can talk more for days or for years. But I would like to take a moment to thank for your honesty to express about this very profound and deep concerns about languages and who we are. To lighten things a little bit, wonder if you can grant me a secret. A secret is with you someday will write a libretto without a composer in mind.
Without a composer?
Without a composer in mind.
Why?
That's interesting. My gut reaction is yes. Yes. Because I have worked on projects where, you know, where I write the lyrics and just hand it over, you know, and it's an interesting kind of process though, because what happens is that I hear a certain kind of music in my mind, even though I'm not a composer, because I don't think that you can write a libretto without something, with some idea, you know, even if you know it's it's not the music that will eventually accompany your words. There is something about maybe it's just me, you know, but yeah. I think the reason why I say, you know, sort of my gut reaction is that the answer is yes, is that it's kind of based on the fact that I think there is a difference between the libretto and then the libretto with the music. And so I don't really hold on to the libretto as being the end product, you know. I think of it as waiting, or as sort of in the process of forming. So I think of it maybe as a draft. So to answer your question, yes, I would write a draft, you know, and then see where a particular composer would sort of, how they would finish it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It's already an hour. And
I'm done with all my questions.
I really enjoy the conversation we have. And I still have a lot of questions. I didn't reach my goal of making it fun
I'm so
enough.
sorry, I talk too much.
I may have to cut the part that you comment too long.
Yeah.
But
Could I ask
Anvi,
you, huh?
I want to say that I thank you for your clarification about where that question about, you know, the Vietnamese language comes from. And so after hearing you say that, I would add that, you know, every language holds within it a particular way of thinking. It holds within it sort of cultural norms, cultural traditions, aspirations, you know. So it's not just a language, it's not just sounds that, you know, mean certain things, you know. They're not just simply tools, it's deeper than that. So I mean, yes, learn as many languages as you can, but again, if you cannot hear your own voice, if you don't have the language of the country that you're part of, that you're missing something, right? So I understand you feeling heartbroken when you're observing this.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I have a few maybe quick questions. So you are a food writer. You write about a lot. Barbecue, isn't that good? Barbecue. You write about mangosteen and pie and the theo kho. So what is your favorite dish in Vietnamese cuisine other than the theo kho that you wrote about?
Canh chua.
What kind of fish? Gas? What kind of fish that goes with it?
Oh, well, first of all, one of the most horrific thing that I've seen in, you know, quote unquote Vietnamese restaurants in the US is when they make canh chua with salmon. That is absolutely the wrong fish. It has to be a fatty fish. It has to be like a catfish, you know, that comes close. But I think in Vietnam, isn't there a fish called something like is it cá bông? Something like that. Anyway, it has to be a fatty fish, you know.
Cá chim.
Cá bông lau.
Cá bông lau.
Is that it?
Yes, bông lau is a fatty one. Yes.
Yeah.
The same.
Cá bông lau is very
same
common.
Type of catfish, but have white dot like flour. That's why they call it.
Oh, that's why it's called that. Okay, see?
Like the same family of catfish. Yeah, but a lot cleaner, a lot less bottom fish.
Okay.
Yeah.
You know, that canh chua has to me all the hallmarks of of why Vietnamese food is brilliant. You know, it has all the notes there, you know. You know, in terms the flavor notes, you know, it has all, you know, it has the sour, the savory, the sweet, you know, the use of fresh herbs, you know, to finish, all of that. Yeah.
So
next question.
you have a special interest in food. does it extend to something else? For example, gardening, because the garden is right, food and garden very close, but does it extend to something else?
Well, I'm sitting in my garden now, and I do not have a green thumb, but my husband does. So I can see around me like mint. I have he has 3 kinds of citrus trees. You know, even though we're in Brooklyn, we bring them in during the colder months. There's a fig tree that I'm staring at right in front of us.
Oh,
So
nice.
yeah,
I love it.
so yes, you I mean,
What do you do in the garden? What are you thinking? Like if you are wearing your hat as a writer, is there anything special that you do in the garden? What is a writer doing in the garden? Let's put it that way.
chances are she's reading, which is what I usually do out in the garden. But I think more integral to me is cooking, you know, with respect to my writing, because that's when I kind of am thinking but not thinking. Does that make sense? You know, I'm thinking about the action that I'm doing, the ingredients that have to be prepared, etc. I'm not thinking about my writing per se, but it's always in the back of my mind, and somehow often, a particular plot point or a particular character sort of development or question that I have can get resolved, because I find that when you are so focused on it as a question, a conflict, your brain can get overwhelmed. You just kind of get lost in all the possibilities, and you just kind of sometimes have to relax. You have to do something else,
Yeah. I know a lot of writers, they do poetry, they do nonfiction, they do fiction. You write novels and your poems are set into music. I'm curious, what is your thought about poetry? What's poetry? What's the position of it in your writing life?
Yeah, poetry is where I go to recharge. When I lose faith in language, I read poems.
Really?
Yeah, because to me, that is, sort of the highest form writing. I aspire to being a poet in some way, and here's really the secret, PQ, about my relationship with writing lyrics. Is it's in a way, I think of it as a way to write poetry without the pressure of calling myself a poet. I don't think I could, I feel like I love the distillation of so many of my favorite poets, the ability just to kind of encapsulate so much in so few words. And that's what I think about when I'm writing my lyrics. I want that word that will kind of cut through, like if you only hear that one word through the orchestration, through everything, that has the power that that I find in so many of my favorites poems.
How does the Vietnamese side in you find this expression in everyday American life? Well, I go back again about the Vietnamese needs, because I care about that.
Yeah.
It could be unfair to Vietnamese Americans, but I'm always
Yeah, it
curious
could be.
of Vietnamese Americans who grew up in this country, what they hold on to, how they do it. It is a lot of things to learn from that as well. So I tend to think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's an excellent question.
Well, of course, in cooking, you cook Vietnamese foods once in a while. That's one thing.
That's one
People
thing,
know
but
that because they read your books and they know. But
I think it goes deeper than that, and it will show up in surprising ways, ways that I probably don't even fully realize. But I'm going to tell you this, that I think that what forms me and sort of shapes me more, I wouldn't, is not necessarily what I would pinpoint as being Vietnamese, but rather as being a Vietnamese refugee. Because I think those are two very different mindsets, you know? And though, of course, there's overlap, but they're very different. At least they are within, I think, the way that I've been formed. So, yeah. This, I feel like, could be like you know it could be like a session with a therapist in order to give you a fuller answer, but I think it's a very good question, and it's a question maybe that I'm always asking myself and asking of my work, and I don't know if I'll ever get a real answer, and maybe you, as someone who's read my work, may be able to see it more than I can. In terms of my day-to-day life, it's hard to see yourself, right? It's hard to, you are in you. So yeah, it's a hard answer.
I think it's true that sometimes it shows in ways that you may not be aware of, because it's already in you and is there. Because my next question would be, you wrote 3 novels. 3 of them have very unique stories. In the first 2, The Book of Salt and Bitter in the Mouth, I can see the common theme. I can see something common. But when I came to the third one, I was surprised. So what is the common thread of all those 3 books that reveal who you are?
Yeah. The third novel is based on the life of a half Greek, half Irish writer named Lafcadio Hearn. He lived from 1850 to 1904, and his story is told from the point of view of 3 women in his life: his Greek mother, his Black wife, Black American wife, and his Japanese wife. That novel is really about the idea of, the constructed idea of the great literary man. And it questions that whole notion. It debunks that entire notion. Yeah. But I think the common thread is what we started our, that we spent a lot of time talking about in our conversation, which is language, and how language often, if not always, fails us.
Could you clarify on that?
Yeah. In the Book of Salt, you have a character, a Vietnamese man living in Paris in the 1920s, 1930s. He has no fluency in the primary languages of the household he's working in, which is in French or in English, you know? And yet, that story is told from his point of view, right? It's his inner thoughts, it's his feelings. And he's funny, he feels deeply. He has this rich emotional life that is in total contrast to the way that the outside world looks at him as simply someone who's a laborer, you know, someone who doesn't have any way to fully communicate what's in his heart, in his mind, you know, and that is not just limited to that character, as we know. I mean, this is something I think about all the time. This is how many of us live, you know, even if, you know, even if we have fluency in the primary language of where we live, sometimes we can't express ourselves, you know, because of a multitude of you know, reasons. It could be something secret that we're keeping to ourselves, to our families, to our community. You know, it is a constant struggle to be understood. And that really is, I think, the through line, you know, with the three novels. And if you look at it, each one of the narrators that I've inhabited can say that it's a struggle to be understood.
We talked a lot in this conversation already, but I still want to ask you this. What are you interested in as a writer? Just a general question.
What am I interested in? I can tell you what I'm interested in as a reader, and that is actually the same response as what I'm interested in as a writer, which is to encounter language in a new way. You know, I love beautiful language, but that is not that's not the only goal, I think, of myself as a writer. I think it's really about pushing the boundaries of what language is capable of. And particularly as a writer of fiction. Because what you have really is you have the page or you have the screen. It's a very intimate relationship that you're having with your reader, you know? And so what can you do with these words that can evoke the same thing that someone who goes to an opera can experience? You know, all the senses, you know, can you create music without music? Can you create the sense of being in a garden without being in a garden? Can you communicate what it feels like to have a summer breeze? You know, these are the same things that, you know, writers have been trying to do for ages. Yes. And yet, you know, when you're encountering a work that is doing it in a way that feels brand new to you, that you haven't, there's something about the combination of words, the combination of something that feels like you haven't seen this before. And that's what I'm always interested in. Like, can I do that?
Okay.
Am I reading someone who's doing that for me? That's exciting, right?
Yeah. It's great. It's a great answer. Okay, the last question is, I think one of the responsibilities of writers is, or people often look at writers and they think writers see through things. So they are supposed to share their wisdom and thoughts. And in this time, difficult time that we are living, divisive and violence and scary, what if even many of them are confused? What to do? How should we go on as writers? What do you do? What have you done?
Right.
My own experience is that I was so frustrated. I froze for a long time. I did not know what to do. Nothing is meaningful enough for me. So I stopped doing anything.
Yeah, that's such a good question. You know, and I hesitate to answer because there are so many answers, but I think what I'm going to sort of I'm going to quote for you. I'll probably misquote it, but the writer Maxine Hong Kingston wrote something about, in a time of destruction, in a time of war, create something. And that seems, just, and what it goes on. It's a beautiful quote, and I wish I had in front of me to share with you. But what it says and what it means to me is that we have to do exactly the opposite of what happened to you, which is we cannot freeze. We have to respond. And that, however, has to be up to the individual and how to do it. Because I cannot sit here and say as a mandate to every single writer, that they must, write op-eds and post on Twitter and, to become public if they are still grappling with these things in a personal way. But we each have the responsibility to respond. And it could be on a one-on-one basis, with your neighbor, someone on the street, your family, your coworker. And when I say respond, I mean you are there for them if they're going through a difficult time, or if they say something to you that you don't agree with, you must find a way to say what you have said is hurtful. What you have said is not helpful to me, to my family, my community, my country. But how you do that and to what scale you do that and how public you are has to be up to you. Can you hear that?
Yeah. Yeah, it's okay. I think we should wrap up, Anvi.
I know that's the last question, but I forgot one important thing in my question because I say you have tremendous, you are a writer with tremendous talent. Do you feel more pressure with the responsibility?
Yes, I do. But I think it goes back to what I said previously, which is you have to hear your own voice. You know, when you're creating, you have to be true to yourself. I have written the op-eds. I have written the political essays. I have suffered the consequences of it. I have a whole folder in my Gmail that's called hate mail. Yeah, you know? Yeah. And but you know, everything that I have tried to do really has come from the heart. I don't think any of us can push ourselves to be what we're not. You know, some Vietnamese American writers, some writers are very political, very public, and that is fantastic, and it is true to who they are, but I would never require that of every single person who wants to be a writer and who is a writer. Yeah, that's all.
That's a good note to end the conversation. I really enjoy this talking to you, and really appreciate your honesty in sharing with us all your thoughts, your stories, and everything. Thank you so much for taking your time to talk to us.
Thank you so much, Monique. These are extremely valuable and intimate and sincere work that you have for us and our audience, and we value that tremendously.
Yeah, and I hope
Thank you.
the audience of VASCAM will appreciate the conversation as we do.
Thank you so much, Anvi, so much, PQ. It's a pleasure to see your faces, to get to know you better, and really always an honor to be able to share my work. Well, yeah, I don't know. That's it.
Yeah.